Hey everyone, just want to say thank you for those of you who attempted to watch the live stream this morning. I am so sorry that things did not work out exactly as we would have liked, in the sense that they didn't seem to work out very well at all. But what I figured I would do is that since that was kind of cut off and didn't function the way that it should, is I would just give my sermon here without any interruptions. I have fairly good internet, so there shouldn't be anything going wrong while we do this. In fact, I'm just going to make sure okay, good. I'm connected to Wi-Fi. Just wanted to make sure of that so there'd be no issues or problems or anything like that. So anyway, I'm just gonna to give the sermon that I gave this morning, and just because I can't seem to get the replay to work at all. So I apologize for missing the worship music aspect of this, but if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn over to Matthew 18. We're opening it up in your, not Word document, I almost said Word document. Open it up on your web browser, whatever it is that you want to be. Hey, Teresa. And Matthew 18. So Matthew 18 is where we're going to be today. And near the end at verse 21 of Matthew 18. But anyway, we're going to talk about forgiveness. And if you've ever had to deal with forgiveness like a normal human being, then you know that forgiveness can be a pretty tricky thing. It's one of those things that we often need, but we don't give out quite as freely as maybe we should. And in fact, I remember not recently, a little while ago, Alexa and I got in a little bit of an argument, and we kind of broke protocol when it came to that, and actually went to bed still not fully resolved, not having completely set everything in place. And so we woke up the next morning and just kind of went through that, the after morning kind of pour over that happens when you get in an argument with your spouse. And anyway, so as the day went on, I eventually decided I was going to be, the one who was going to apologize first. And so I came up behind her and I gave her kind of a half-hearted apology. And what I pictured in my mind is that that I would say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have talked like that, I shouldn't have said those things, it was just a disagreement, it was just a misunderstanding or whatever it might be. And then I thought that she would come back and say, yes, I'm sorry. Couples do this all the time, where one apologizes and then the other one apologizes. And so that's what I figured would happen. But I came up and I hugged her and I just gave that, it wasn't even that genuine, and you'll see why in a minute, but I hugged her and I said, I'm sorry about last night and all that. And all that she said in response was, thank you. I was like waiting there for a good 30 seconds, just thinking maybe she's catching her breath. Maybe she's not quite done with answering me right now. But it ended at thank you. And then not 30 seconds later, which, by the way, after she just said thank you, I felt cheated, which is a pretty good marker that you haven't actually forgiven someone and you don't really mean your apology. If you say you're sorry and then they don't say it back and then you feel cheated, that's not a good thing when it comes to forgiving someone. But like moments after that whole interaction, she reached across me for something and she knocked me in the face. I mean, it was like gentle, just a little thing like that. And then she looks at me and she says, oh, sorry about that. I was like, really? That you're going to apologize? Really? Okay, fine, we'll deal with that. And what's crazy is that, we work things out. I noticed that I didn't mention that this morning, and Alexa said, you made it sound like I never apologized. And we did, like we both apologized for it. But apology and forgiveness is a very tricky thing, and it gets us in a lot of trouble. And for marriages, especially if you're in a marriage that is void of forgiveness, you're in a marriage that is not going to last. Just like in any relationship, really. If you're in any relationship, whether it's friends, even family, co-workers, if it's void of forgiveness, there's going to be major problems. And what we're going to see today is that that's even true in our relationship with God. If we are completely void of forgiveness, then there's major problems between us and God. And it's going to get in the way of who he wants us to be and what we're going to do. Forgiveness is tricky. If I were to ask you, for instance, hi Nathan, if I were to ask you, what is forgiveness? It's one of those things that like you probably instantly want to jump into. Like if I were to ask you, what is love? But then when you start thinking about it, you may not really have a good answer. I mean, it's one of those things that we like know, but we don't. Thanks, Nathan, for all the hearts. It's one of those things that we know, but we don't really know how to explain. Like forgiveness is just kind of a thing that happens. But if we're going to... Thanks, buddy. You're not interrupting this at all. If we're going to talk about something as important as forgiveness, we need to understand what it is. We need to ask ourselves, what does it mean? When the Bible tells us that I have to forgive someone, what am I actually supposed to be doing? Some people will say that forgiveness is like forgetting, right? Forgive and forget. You've probably heard that saying before. Others might say that it's not holding something against someone else or not giving someone what their actions deserve. Others might say forgiveness happens when anger fades, and that's how you know that you've forgiven someone. And those ideas on forgiveness work in general. Like in generalities, in very soft situations. And in fact, they preach very well too when we talk about forgiveness. You know, just do this or that, and then boom, you're all done. And we just make it seem like it's a Hallmark movie where it's just so simple. The ending comes and you just knew it was always going to work out like that. But the truth is, forgiveness is hard. I mean, when we preach about forgiveness, I've certainly preached my fair share of sermons on forgiveness. You've heard your fair share of sermons on forgiveness. You think about it, and we talk about the times that we should forgive one another when it makes sense. When we do things to one another that are within comprehension. But we know full well that humans are very capable of doing things that are terrible and awful. And then we hear things like we need to forgive. I don't think we quite realize how controversial forgiveness is. In fact, if you've read the news, if you've read articles on people who forgive others in popular culture, it's not popular. In fact, many times it is looked down upon because it makes it look as if you're just giving a pass, as if you're now lifting the other person up in such a way that you're condoning what they did. See, the truth is, real forgiveness, the forgiveness that we're actually called to have, is one of the most controversial things about the Christian faith. And we don't talk about it that way. We talk about it like it should be a given, like it's something that's easy, that should just come to you. And the truth is that it's not. We should be able to forgive one another in the simple things. You know, someone in sermons you probably hear, especially on forgiveness, we love using traffic examples. Someone cuts you off, right? Well, I had to forgive them in my heart, right? There are a lot of pastors I've heard tell really funny stories of problems that they've had while they're driving, and everyone laughs, and you know, I had to forgive that person out of my heart for doing that awful thing or whatnot. But the truth is, real forgiveness that we have weighing on our shoulders is so much bigger than that. Because we don't have to forgive just the silly things. We have to forgive everyone. And I mean everyone. And I don't know if that hits you too hard. But there was a woman once who was at a party on a Saturday night. She was trying to blow off some steam from a real hard work week. And she was finally just letting loose and just enjoying her time when a guy caught her eye. Handsome dude and just personable, nice. He seemed funny. He treated her right during those little bit of time that she had together with him. And as the night progressed, she eventually wanted to be able to talk with him where there wasn't music just blaring down on them. And so they go out into a back alleyway where she thought that they would be able to talk without being interrupted. But he had no interest in talking. And as soon as they got out there, he made his intentions known and just started coming towards her. And no matter how often she said no, he didn't give up. And her cries for help went unanswered. No one was around. And she was overtaken. When everything finished, she left as fast as she could, got in her car and started driving home and dealt with the conflicting emotions running through her head in that moment. She felt dirty and used and battered and messed up. And she didn't know how to process things. She tried sleeping that night, but every single time she started to drift off for even just a moment, the memories of what happened just jolted her awake. When the sun finally rose and it was morning, she got cleaned up and she figured she would go to church because perhaps that would help her feel a little more clean. And she gets into the pew and she just aches a smile out for everyone who comes by. She doesn't want anyone to know that something's wrong. And she sits down in the pew and the pastor gets up to preach. And these are the words that she hears. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your Father in heaven will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive other people their sins, your Father in heaven will not forgive you. What do you say to this woman? I mean, we have a lot of axioms that we use in our culture about forgiveness, things that are just easy to memorize. You put it out there. I've heard one quote quite often that not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to be sick, which I get that, or forgive and forget. We have these simple things that we say over and over. But if you were face to face with that woman who was living through what she just endured, all that I just talked about, and you were talking to her, would you really lead off with the whole poison thing? I mean, she was the one that was hurt and violated and has to walk away somehow feeling guilty about something that's not her fault. And you're going to do the poison thing. We need a clear understanding of what forgiveness is. Because you can't oversimplify it. You can't just tell people it's easy. You can't just tell people you gotta and then walk away from it. We need to know what it means. For that woman sitting there in that pew, hearing that sermon, hearing those words from Jesus himself saying you have to forgive if you want to be forgiven. What does that mean? What does she do with all that is running inside of her in that moment? We need to know what forgiveness actually is. There's parts to this whole discussion about forgiveness that Jesus and the rest of the scripture as a whole address that help clear up some of these major misconceptions we have about forgiveness. Because Jesus, as far as I've read, doesn't have some sort of quick axiom that you can just remember, that he lived by, that he just told you to say over and over again. You don't see a lot of bumper stickers about it. In fact, one time when Jesus was asked about forgiveness, there in Matthew 18, if you're there, Matthew 18, starting in verse 21, when he was asked about forgiveness, he didn't just give some quick answer. He gave a very long story. And it always prompted by a question from Peter, which I know might be shocking to some of you that Peter would dare speak in the presence of Jesus. But here we are. If you're there in Matthew 18, verse 21, it says, when Peter came to Jesus and he asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister when they sin against me? 7 times? I mean, you listen to that and you're probably thinking, well, that's not very grace-filled. I mean, especially if you've been raised in the church. We've been taught over and over, you just forgive people, right? There's no end to it. And so you look at Peter suggesting 7 times, you think, well, that seems kind of low. But keep in mind, in his culture, that was actually pretty graceful. What he said, that's a lot of grace that he was willing to extend, because in his day, most of the rabbis taught you only had to forgive someone 3 times. And then that was it, right? 3. Okay, making sure I didn't go 3 times. Anyway, 3. Yep, 1, 2, 3. But anyway, most rabbis back then taught you only had to forgive someone 3 times. And then that was it. So Peter doubled that and then added 1. So he's probably like, yeah, this is 7 times, right, Jesus? So imagine his surprise when Jesus responds with this in verse 22. There in Matthew 18, it says, Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Or your translation might say 7 times 70. And before you start going into the math here, Jesus is not telling you to add up those numbers and then keep a track where you can, okay, well, they wronged me here. Now I'm going to start keeping track. Jesus's point is that you forgive someone so often that you forget. You can't keep track of it. You just keep forgiving them over and over and over. And the reason why is because, and it's laid out more in this story we're about to read, Jesus does something in this story that is absolutely necessary for us to understand about forgiveness. Perspective. Jesus gives us perspective on forgiveness here. So if you're there, once again, Matthew 18, just look at what Jesus shares here in verses 23 through 35. It's this whole story that he tells us here. Jesus says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he wasn't able to pay, shocking that he wouldn't just have 10,000 bags of gold on hand. Since he wasn't able to pay, the master ordered that he, his wife, and his children, and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Which, by the way, wouldn't even make a dent into it. 10,000 bags of gold. This guy's not worth 10,000 bags of gold. But anyway, at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. And he says, be patient with me, please. He begged, I will pay back everything. Just think about how unlikely that is for just a moment. I'm going to pay you back. He doesn't even say have mercy on me and then leave it there, because there's no way in all this world he's going to be paying this money back. But he says, I'll pay it back. Just give me more time. Not likely. Anyway, so he continues here. When the servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and just let him go. 10,000 bags of gold in debt. And the master's like, okay, you know what? I feel sorry for you. Stop crying. Get out of here. You're taken care of. But then listen to this weird shift. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Notice, not 100 bags of silver coins, just 100 coins, like 1 bag's worth of silver coins. He grabbed him and he began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he yelled at him. His fellow servant fell on his knees and he begged him. Notice his wording here. Be patient with me and I will pay it back. Now, unlike this dishonest dude that started off, this fellow servant probably could have paid him back over time. But notice what he does instead. He refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt back. Now, if you don't know this about being in jail, not a lot of chance of paying back a debt when you can't work. So basically, he's condemned the dude to death in jail forever for 100 silver coins. When the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged. And they went and they told their master everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in. Yep, this is it. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all of that debt of yours just because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured, notice this, until he could pay his debt back. 10,000 bags of gold coins. Once again, I don't know if you know this about torture, but you don't earn a whole lot of money while you're being tortured. And Jesus concludes with this. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you unless you forgive your brother or sister from the heart. Now, there's some details I try to clear up in that story, such as the fact that there's a pretty significant difference between what the servant owed the master and what the fellow servant owed the servant. So the NIV translates it as 10,000 bags of gold coins and then 100 silver coins. And that doesn't mean a whole lot to us. So just understand it this way. The servant owed the master millions upon millions of dollars. So much money that he could work the rest of his life at a real well-paying job. And his kids could work the rest of their lives at a real well-paying job, and so on and so forth, down many generations. And they wouldn't even put a dent in this. I mean, there was no hope that he was going to pay off this debt. And then his fellow servant comes to him and owes him, says 100 silver coins. That's about $15,000, more or less. It's about a third of a year's wages. So obviously it depends on how much money you make and whatnot. But think of it as about $15,000, right? Compared to millions and millions of dollars. And he doesn't forgive him. I mean, that's quite a discrepancy there. I mean, he doesn't even give him a chance. It's not even that he didn't forgive him. He could have given him more time, but he didn't even have an ounce of mercy. And to make it worse, by having this guy arrested, he was actually taking more money away from the king. Because how does the king get his money? From taxes, from people working. That maybe is a lesson for us right now, but still, it doesn't matter. The point is, he made things even worse for the king by having this guy arrested. The audacity of this servant is just incredible. And you know, thinking about it, before I even go on, you realize who you are in this story, right? Who we are. Anyway, that's just a thing anywhere. But so Jesus, though, I don't know if you realize this, but notice that when Jesus tells this parable about how much another person owed this guy, he doesn't use pennies. He doesn't say that this guy, this fellow servant, owed the servant $100. Or he didn't even say $5. He didn't say he only owed him a couple of pennies. He owed him 100 silver coins. He owed him $15,000. Jesus is not downplaying the debt people rack up against you. The hurt that you've experienced, the pain that people have caused you, Jesus is not downplaying that at all. What he is doing here is helping us gain some perspective, to help us understand what forgiveness really is. The word for forgiveness, at least the one that's commonly used, including here and back in Matthew chapter 6, it means to send away. It means to release. So when you forgive someone, that's what we're talking about. It's not all those other axioms. It's not all the things that you've heard about. All you are doing is releasing them from the debt that they owe you. Why? Not because you earned it. I'm sorry, not because they deserve it. Not because they earned it. Not because they paid you back. But because God first released you from your debt. And he released me from my debt. Perspective. See, God knew that I was going to rack up so much sin and debt that I could spend an eternity trying to pay it off, and it was never going to happen. And so rather than condemning me to an eternity away from him, Romans talks about that. Paul tells us that the wages of sin is death. That means what you've earned with even just one sin, but with your life, is eternal separation from God. And that wasn't going to be good enough for God. So rather than making you pay, he had planned from the beginning a way that he would release you from your debt and put it on himself. He released your debt. And now in return, we do the same. Whether that debt is $5, someone cuts you off in traffic, or $50,000. And it's that thing that person did to you. You don't forgive them. You don't release them from what they owe you because of who they are, but because of who you are and who God is working in you. Because the truth is, that act that they did to you will be paid for eventually. It's going to be paid for in one of two ways. Either they will spend an eternity paying it off and never actually paying it off, or they will one day realize all that Jesus did for them, and they will realize that they have to now put on the shoulders of Jesus that act that they committed against you. Forgiveness requires a hefty scoop of faith. Big scoop of faith. Faith that even if they never face punishment here on earth for the atrocity, they will one day stand in the judgment hall of God himself and have to answer to his face what he did, what they did to his child. It's going to be answered for in one way or another. But it requires faith on our part. Paul in Romans 12 is writing to believers who are going to be enduring persecution and torture. They're going to see loved ones, family members, even sons, daughters, be tortured and killed. And into that mess, Paul says, don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. It is written, it's mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. Forgiveness requires the type of faith that knows that one day God will repay it, one way or another. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences. I think that's also important for us to understand. A lot of people think that if you forgive someone, you don't, quote unquote, hold anything against them. Kind of. But here's the thing. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean you trust them again. What it means is that you don't feel like they owe you anything anymore because you've released that of them. They are not having to pay you back because you've forgiven the debt that they owe you, right? That's what we're talking about. But it does not mean that you start to trust people or those people immediately again. That's why I'm not a huge fan of the whole forgive and forget thing. Because especially if you've gone through one of those situations that I described at the beginning of this message, you don't forget that. It's with you. So you can forgive someone without forgetting. You release them of the debt. But just because you forgive someone, like I said, doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences. For instance, you know that God hates sin. He hates what was done to you so much. And just because you've released that person from the debt they owe you doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences. And I'm not just talking about in the life after this. There are things that we do to one another that require a debt to be paid to society. And just because you forgive them doesn't mean that they don't owe that debt to society. And always, no matter what happens, what has happened to you, there's a debt to God whenever sin is involved. In fact, this question that Peter asked at the beginning there of Matthew 18 was prompted by a teaching from Jesus in the paragraph leading up to that. I encourage you, go and read it. It starts in verse something or other. We start in verse 21, so it's a paragraph right before that. The Bible's, anyway. You know what? Now I feel bad. I'm convicted. I'm going to have to tell you. It starts in verse 15. There you go. 15 through 20. Yep, 15 through 20. You should, anyway, read it. But what Jesus talks about there is actually sin in the context of the church. And he says, if someone sins against you, go to them, just yourself, just one-on-one, and you tell them about it. Because there's a possibility they may not realize that they sinned against you. We've done stupid things before without realizing it until someone points it out to us. So go and tell them. And if they don't listen to you, bring 1 or 2 people with you. And if 1 or 2 people don't convince them, bring it before the whole church. These are the words of Jesus. You take this in front of the entire church. And if they still won't listen, Jesus tells us to treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. In other words, kick them out of the church. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there are no consequences. Jesus did not say deal with sin in the church simply by forgiving them in the way that we understand forgiveness. You go through this process he describes without feeling like you are owed anything, but if they're not willing to admit what they did was wrong or harmful, then you don't want to keep that in the context of the church. So Jesus tells us what to do. There's consequences for our actions. Forgiveness does not do away with that. Release. That's forgiveness. And it's a process I think of as kind of like a ripple effect. You willfully release them. Yet that's the first step of forgiveness, is you willfully say, you owe me nothing. I forgive it entirely. You cannot pay me back. But then there's a ripple effect of healing that happens thereafter. And sometimes that healing only takes 5 minutes. Sometimes even shorter. And other times the healing will take place for the rest of your life as God helps you deal with the emotions and the hurt and the pain that you now have to bear because of what that person did to you. Just because you are working through that hurt doesn't mean you haven't forgiven them. It just means you've released them. They didn't earn it. In the same way that you didn't earn your release that God has granted to you. Because I look at my life, and in the grand scheme of eternity, I am no prize to be won. And yet, what did God do? You know, the writer of Hebrews, I talked about this on Facebook on Friday, but the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 12, after he spends all of 11 looking at all these different examples of faith, and he says, since we have this great crowd of witnesses surrounding us, in fact, our next sermon series, we're going to look at Hebrews 11, but since you have all this great, then focus your eyes on the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, Jesus Christ, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame. That means he didn't even consider it. When Jesus was in the garden and he prayed for God to take this cup from him, he knew what he was going to have to go through. And he still did it. For the joy set before him. You know what that joy was? His accomplished mission of saving the world. His mission of giving all of himself so that we could be back with God. That's why we can forgive. Because Jesus paid it all and not even considered what hurt and pain and shame he would have to endure, because his eyes were on you. His eyes were on me. The imperfect people that run around and do our own things and do awful, terrible things to one another. He looked at us with love that we cannot even begin to comprehend. And he says, I want them. And if you've never accepted that incredible love, I want you to call me. I'll even say my cell phone number here, although I think most people on here already have it, but it's 760-449-1474. And I'm telling you, God loves you. And if he's able to use someone like me, and like so many people in ministry and in churches across this country, he wants you. And he went to the cross knowing how much you mean to him. Forgive and release. Give that weight to Jesus. Because unlike us, he can handle it. And he wants it from you. If you need me, you call. You have a blessed night and an incredible week. Serve him and forgive in awesome and powerful ways. Not because the people deserve it. Not because they will ever be able to pay you back. But because of our faith in God. Because he released me.